This episode is brought to you by my 10-week Fertility Awareness Mastery group program. If you're listening in real time, new groups are forming in April of 2018. Reserve your spot today by heading over to fertilityfriday.com/group program. That's fertilityfriday.com/group program. This is the Fertility Friday podcast, episode number 191. Welcome to the 191st episode of the Fertility Friday podcast. Thank you for joining me today. I'm Lisa from fertilityfriday.com, and this is your source for information about the fertility awareness method and all things fertility. I've got a great episode for you today. I was so excited and inspired to create this episode. I've been doing my fertility awareness mastery group programs for quite some time now. And one of the things that has come out every time I do this group is the importance of monitoring for cervical health. It's something that I see all the time. It's very, very common for women to have issues with cervical health and not know about it because the signs are so subtle. And it's only when you're charting and working with a trained practitioner who can, pay attention, look at these things and bring them to your attention that you would even know. So I've worked with women who have been charting their cycles for years, but they just had no idea the connection between the cervical health and the type of observations that they were seeing in terms of cervical mucus or otherwise. And so that's why I created today's episode, because I really wanted to take you through some of those basic things to look for to know if there could be an issue with your cervix and your cervical health that are subtle enough that you wouldn't necessarily think there's a problem, but obvious to me because I do this for a living. I do this all the time. So if you're listening to this episode in real time, registration for my next round of Fertility Awareness Mastery is now open. So if you're wanting to jump in and join us, make sure to head over to fertilityfriday.com/group program. Now, Fertility Awareness Mastery is my 10-week intensive fertility awareness group program. And basically, the program takes you on a journey. So we really delve into fertility awareness in great detail. So we take several sessions in the very beginning to go through everything. I go through and I do a live introductory session where we go through all of the basics. We really cover all of the fundamentals of charting in depth. So we really get into cervical mucus. I think that forms one of the constant and consistent themes in the program, where we really go through it in great detail so that every member of the group is very, very confident in interpreting and understanding and charting her cervical mucus. We go through cervical position in great detail, and that's a topic that for most of the women that I work with is really, really confusing because for any of you who've tried to check your cervix, the position of your cervix, it's not always straightforward. So we really go through that in a lot of detail, and you leave feeling really, really confident and able to interpret it. And then, of course, basal body temperature. There's a lot of challenges in charting your basal body temperature. So we really hash out the basics. And I've designed the program to be 10 weeks to give you enough time to really go through all of these factors in detail while you chart in real time. So my analogy for charting, it's like you can't learn how to drive by reading a book. You really have to do it. So we have the classroom portion, but then you have to go away and actually chart your signs and figure it out. And then every week you come back to me with great questions about certain snags that you ran into or certain observations that you saw that didn't make sense. And basically the group allows us time to really work through all of that together. So in this 2.5 to 3 month program, it really gives you the opportunity to go through 3 full charts, depending on the length of your menstrual cycle, and really have that support during that time. So at the end of the program, you come out feeling super confident about the charting aspect. And what I find is that towards the end of the program, the comments and the questions kind of turn from, how do I make this observation and how do I do this, to really, how do I interpret my chart? I'm seeing this abnormal pattern. I'm seeing these abnormal temperatures. What can I really do to support that? And so a huge part of our program is really focusing on those things. And we do it by what I call rotating hot seats. So it's like every member of the group has an opportunity to have a session in the group. And so everyone gets to be present and witness that, which is a really incredible way to accelerate your knowledge about fertility awareness, because not only are you getting insight about your own chart, but you're getting insight about everyone else's chart, and you see a ton of different scenarios. So I really hope that you will join us in the Fertility Awareness Mastery Group program. We still have a spot for you. Make sure to head over to fertilityfriday.com/group program for more information. Now let's jump into today's episode. In today's episode, I wanted to take some time to talk about cervical health. It's a topic that comes up whenever I do any of my group programs. So historically, in every single group that I have that I have done, and I've been doing this for a couple of years now, the topic of cervical health has come up in one way or another. And a big part of that is because we're looking at charts, and issues with cervical health are very, very common. And that's one of the things that I always share with my clients is that, if you see something that looks a little bit abnormal or concerning, you would be surprised how common it is. But even though it's so common, because most women aren't charting their cycles and aren't paying such close attention to their cervical mucus, often even when I'm working with women who have been charting their cycles previously, when they come and learn to chart with me, we're charting in different ways. We're looking at mucus in a very specific and kind of structured way, meaning that we're paying very close attention to all of these different factors. We're paying close attention to the color, to the consistency, to when you're seeing it in your cycle, what qualities does it have? How many times a day are you seeing it? So we're actually paying very close attention, really zoning into your cervical mucus, your cervical health. And by doing that, it gives us a very interesting, very clear perspective on what's happening with your cervix. So when you're paying attention and monitoring your cervical health in that way, which it sounds a little bit, I suppose that as I describe it, it sounds like it's really involved, but paying attention to your cervix isn't more involved than the charting that you're doing now, really. It just involves doing your observations and writing them down. And that is something, as we've talked about on the podcast quite a bit, that is a fairly simple habit to develop. Once you get into the habit, it's just like anything else. So no one finds it to be particularly, or arduous to brush their teeth every day. And so, if this is something that you're wanting to adopt, it's fairly straightforward in a very similar way. But the point is that when you're paying attention to your cervix in this way, and you're really paying close attention to your observations, your cervical mucus, and all these different aspects of your cervix, when you're kind of like you're shining a light on it. And when you do that, then you actually have the opportunity to see any challenges that might come up. You see them in the earliest possible instance. So what I often find when I'm working with clients is that this is one of the first opportunities that we've really had to pay attention to your cervix. And as a result, we're often able to detect issues with your cervix, whether that's an underlying infection, even abnormal cells, like any type of issue with the cervix. You can really pick up on it quickly when you're paying close attention to what you're seeing in the chart. So of course, the first question that comes to mind is, well, how would I know? What does a normal cervical mucus observation look like so that I would know if something was off? How would I know if there was a problem? And so let's start by talking about cervical mucus and getting a real clear sense, pardon the pun, of what your typical cervical mucus observations would look like, what categories they would fall into. And so when we think of what is a normal cervical mucus observation, what would that look like? So cervical mucus falls into two broad categories. One category is non-peak, and the other category is peak. And so non-peak mucus is mucus that is not clear and not stretchy. So it's typically cloudy white, and it often looks like creamy hand lotion. And in order for us to consider it mucus, there has to be enough of it that we can actually pick up between our fingers. So when we're thinking about creamy hand lotion, like if I actually squeeze a little bit of hand lotion onto my hand and I'm playing with it between my fingers, that's what I would think of when I think of non-peak mucus. So as a broad category, it includes mucus that doesn't really stretch a whole lot, although it might stretch a little bit. It is typically cloudy white in color. So that would be the non-peak category. And then the peak category is mucus. That's the mucus that we typically think of if you've read Taking Charge of Your Fertility, or if you've been part of any of the fertility awareness forums online when, you hear egg white cervical mucus. So peak mucus is either clear or stretchy or lubricative. And so what that means is that peak mucus has kind of like a continuum. So it doesn't have to be quote unquote egg white. And what that means for any of you who may not be familiar with that term, it's like raw egg whites. So it's the consistency of a raw egg white, which is kind of like clear and you can kind of stretch it. So if you had some in your hand, if you had some on your fingers, you could actually pull it apart and it would form a thread between your fingers. But that is only one of the qualities of peak mucus. So if it's clear, if it's stretchy, but also if it is if when you're wiping, you feel a really lubricative, like a really slippery sensation, that's another quality of peak mucus. So the degree to which it stretches or if it's more watery. So to be clear, I think one of the things that we need to be clear on is what, watery is a term that is often used, but there's a few, like that term itself can be problematic because that's a quality and you can have an observation that is like water that is not mucus. So that's why this distinction is important. Cervical mucus is a hydrogel, meaning that it's made primarily of water. And so cervical mucus can have anywhere from an 80 to 99% water content, according to what the research has to say. And so if your cervical mucus during this cycle has a particularly high water content, then what can happen is it doesn't really stretch between your fingers anymore. And it's kind of like water. But when you wipe yourself, it's like super, super slippery. So if you've ever had that, experience of going to the bathroom and you go to wipe and you basically try to wipe and your toilet paper kind of slides. And I always joke like your hand hits the back of the toilet. So that is a slippery sensation. So if you have mucus that is clear or that is stretchy, or you have that slippery sensation, then all of those would come into that second category of mucus, which is peak. And so we have these two separate categories. We have peak and non-peak. And so what we're looking for, how do we know if your mucus is normal and healthy? Well, what I would say is that we would be looking for a mucus that is either cloudy or white. It is clear, like crystal clear, or somewhere in the middle. So it could look like you took some lotion and mixed it in, so it's kind of like cloudy and clear at the same time. But that would be the color that we're looking for. That would be what we would consider to be normal. And then in terms of the consistency, as I mentioned, with peak mucus or even like a combination of peak and non-peak, the stretchiness can vary. But typically, because cervical mucus does have a high water content, we do expect it to be fairly liquidy. Like it's a hydrogel. So if you think about like lube, like the texture of like KY jelly or something, like, or maybe that's not the best example, but I'm thinking of the different lubes that I use for demonstration purposes. But basically we're thinking about it. It's still a bit liquidy. It's like a gel. It's not like super, super dry. So that's just a general sense of what we would consider. But of course, those observations are not the only kind that women can have. So the charting system that I use, I always joke that it's like everything that could come out of your vagina is on that piece of paper. So in that charting system, it's all there. And so we have what I just described, which is the optimal, what we would expect, like when your cervix is healthy, we would expect your mucus to fall into one of those categories. We would expect it to fall into one of those color categories, texture categories. But obviously, that's not the only observation that women see. So a few things to watch for and look for if you're concerned. How do you know if your cervical mucus is off, or what are some of those early signs that there might be an issue with your cervix? So there's a couple of things. One is mucus that is off color. So for instance, if you have mucus on a consistent basis that is yellow, that is something that we want to look at. So it is possible that, not in every single case, it wouldn't necessarily be a problem. But from my experience working with women, if you have cervical mucus that is yellow, and it's not, we're not talking about like urine on the tissue. We're talking about the actual mucus is yellow. And it's consistently so. It's not just like one time you see it, it's like consistently yellow. The first thing, you're just going to want to know that yellow mucus is not considered to be optimal, and it can be a sign of infection or inflammation. So you want to make note of that on your chart. Make sure you're noting it and marking it. And whenever I see yellow mucus on a chart, it's a sign that, okay, we should check this out further. So another sign is gummy mucus. So the best way to describe gummy mucus is mucus that is not as liquidy. And so the example that I often use is, if you've ever got a new credit card in the mail or some sort of card and you pull it off the paper, there's on the back of it, there's like this gummy stuff and you have to kind of peel it off, and you can really stretch it between your fingers, but it's not liquid. It's kind of more like gum. And so that is what that means. Gummy mucus, it's kind of like gum. And so if you've had mucus like that, where it's kind of like a ball, like you can literally make a ball with it in your finger, or if you pull it, it kind of snaps back because it's kind of like gum, that can be an early sign of cervical inflammation. And so it's important to know that that is not optimal either, and it can be a sign that there's something wrong. And a third observation, which can be a little bit harder to quantify, but it's an observation where your cervix, it's like it's making water. So throughout your cycle, outside of your fertile window, so your fertile window happens around ovulation. So, depending on how many days of cervical mucus you have, you're going to have your period, and then you might see some so like a couple of days before you see any real mucus, and then you start seeing mucus, and that continues until you ovulate. And then after you ovulate, your mucus stops or changes, but typically stops. And then for the rest of your cycle until you ovulate, you don't really have any more mucus. So there's another observation that is fairly common, and I've had a number of clients that have experienced this, where outside of their fertile window, so, we're not in the estrogen peaking cervical mucus producing time, like we're not approaching ovulation, and maybe you've ovulated already, but you're still having this observation, but it's kind of like water. So, every time you wipe yourself, it's kind of wet, like there's just always something there. And some women will actually experience like what they describe as gushes of water. And it's obvious, like it's so obviously not mucus, because for women who are charting, I mean, if you're charting your cervical mucus and your temperature, and you know that you ovulated, so you would know that you ovulated either because your cervical mucus dried up or because your temperature went up. So you've already confirmed ovulation, but then you keep having these observations. It's like it's wet, or the description of having like literally a gush of water. And it's obviously not mucus, because it couldn't be mucus because you've already ovulated. Okay. But so those three signs, when you're seeing observations like that, the wetness, the gushing water, that is one of the ways that abnormal cervical cells show up on your menstrual cycle chart. And so what is really important when it comes, like, to kind of break it all down, and the reason why I wanted to do an episode specifically about this is because I don't really know of that many other resources and places that are publicly talking about cervical health in this way, in the way that empowers you as a woman to be able to monitor what's happening and to know the difference between what's normal and what's not, and to have the ability to really have that it's kind of like that early warning system. And so I suppose the key takeaway to this part of the podcast is that there is a difference between a normal, healthy cervix and cervical mucus production. And there is a line where it can become kind of crossover into problematic territory. And so, the first thing is to know, like, what does normal, healthy cervical mucus look like? And so we talked about that, and we talked about the difference between peak and non-peak mucus. And then what are some of the signs that there could be a problem? And so that would be mucus that is off color, so mucus that is yellow, mucus that is gummy, or having those observations that are wet, where you're experiencing something that is like water and it's not slippery. So that's a distinction. Water is not slippery. So even though you're having this gush, it is not slippery. So your hand is not hitting the back of the toilet. And you're also not having those, like, you're seeing that outside of your fertile window. So it's not mucus because you're not, like, it's just not within that fertile window. And it's not as you approach ovulation. And it's also consistent. Like, it's not just one time. You're seeing it, before you hit your fertile window, you're seeing it after, and you're seeing it cycle after cycle. So it's a pattern that you're seeing. It's not just like one time. And so you may be wondering, what would be some of the reasons? What are some of the factors that could impact cervical health negatively? And so, the first reason that I'm going to talk about, it's not going to come as a ton of, huge surprise, because it's something I talk about a lot on the podcast. And that is hormonal contraceptives. And so what the research shows is that long-term use of hormonal contraceptives, so like combined pills or, some sort of version of hormonal contraceptives, but what the research shows is that long-term use, and long-term in this context, in some of the studies, they define long-term as 2 years or more, and in others, they would define it as, say, like 8 or 9 years or more than that. But basically, the more years, like, the higher the risk, because the effects are cumulative. So what the research shows is that long-term use of hormonal contraceptives is associated with a deficiency in folate. And what's really interesting is that there's a very clear link in the research between folate deficiency and cervical abnormalities. And so in terms of, what are some of those early ways to tell if you might have abnormal cervical cells, it's interesting to note that link in the literature between folate and your cervix. And so what the research shows is that, women who have used hormonal contraceptives long term are more likely to have deficiencies in folate, are more likely to have abnormal cervical cells, and are thus more likely to have issues with cervical dysplasia or HPV and even cervical cancer. And it's interesting because the link between hormonal birth control and HPV, obviously it's not that women who are on hormonal birth control are more likely to catch HPV. So one thing you should know about HPV is that there are at least 100 different strains of it. And HPV, you can think of it like the flu. So there's all these strains and all of us are exposed to it. And so eventually all of us get it. So if you are a woman and you live in the world, if you are a human being and you've ever had sexual contact with another human being, you have likely come into contact with the HPV virus. And because there's 100 different strains, 100 or more, there's all these, so you think of it, if you think of it like the flu, it makes more sense. So we're all exposed to it. But why is it then that women who are on hormonal contraceptives typically have a harder time getting rid of it? So what the research shows is that long-term hormonal contraceptive use is associated with the increased persistence of an HPV infection. So it's not that you're more likely to get it, but if you do get it, you are less able to fight it off. So your body, just doesn't have kind of that gusto to get it off or to fight it off. And so in women who are otherwise healthy and whose cervix has not been kind of altered or anything through the use of hormonal birth control long term, they're typically able to fight it off. And so that's why when you have an abnormal PAP, the doctor just says, well, come back in 3 months or come back in 6 months, because typically we just fight it off. Like it just goes away. And it's only in more rare occasions that the infection itself is persistent, meaning that our body can't get rid of it. And so that's how hormonal birth control is linked to cervical health, and then the link between HPV and the link between abnormal cells is that when the cervix is deficient, like when you are deficient in folate, then that's what destroys your natural defenses. So it makes it harder for your body to fight it off. So there's this link in the research then between folate deficiency, cervical abnormalities, and a reduced ability to fight off the HPV infection. So what does this have to do with your cervical health? So one of the things that I especially watch for when I'm working with a woman who has recently come off of hormonal birth control, especially if she's used it long term, I look on her chart for signs of a possible issue with her cervix. And so I'm looking for yellow mucus, gummy mucus, and I'm looking for kind of random observations of wetness outside of her fertile window. And so it's important to know how those things are related and how those things are linked, because then it gives us the ability to just pay closer attention to it. Of course, being able to identify these issues through your chart and being able to identify those early gives you a huge leg up, because then you're able to kind of go and get these things checked out before they become a significant problem. And so what I can say is from my chair, because I've seen literally thousands of menstrual cycle charts and worked with hundreds of women at this point, is that I can't really count how many times that I've been able to support a woman to identify different types of underlying infections or different issues with cervical health just by looking at her chart. And so this is one of the areas where charting is very, very important and can be very important as an early indicator, as an early warning sign. Before you have any overt symptoms of these issues, before the infection gets worse, before the abnormal cells totally get out of control, you can actually see the early warning signs of it on your chart. So in addition to hormonal contraceptive use, we also want to look at in general nutrient deficiencies, because of course it's not only women that use hormonal birth control that have issues with cervical health. So just as we talked about folate. If you think about what is it that your body needs to form a good immune response, what does your body need to fight off infections and things like that? Well, you need to have good nutrition. You need to make sure that you have a balanced diet. You need to make sure you're getting enough B vitamins in general. So folate being particularly important, but B vitamins in general. And of course, vitamin A, so retinol preformed vitamin A, is a critical immune vitamin. It historically has been referred to as an immune vitamin. And so just thinking about ways to support your body, support your immune system, and make sure you're getting a sufficient amount of nutrition. Now, of course, when we're looking at cervical health, one of the other factors that could contribute to some of these abnormal patterns that we're seeing with cervical mucus is bacterial overgrowth and infection. So that's something, and it's interesting as well because it doesn't always mean that it's like an STI. So when we think about bacterial overgrowth and infections, your menstrual cycle chart can be like a very first early indicator of any abnormal kind of microbial visitors, for lack of a better word, that are locating themselves in your vagina and your cervix. And so sometimes it can actually be a little bit uncomfortable because I'm, working with somebody and it's kind of like, well, I think that because of what we're seeing, you should get a screen. And especially if that person has been in a, relationship with one person for several years, it can kind of seem like, well, how is it possible that I could have something when I'm been with the same person? And so I just want to talk about that a little bit. So when you're seeing, like we mentioned, some of the signs, so like yellow mucus, gummy mucus, like different types of observations, combination of it, those types of things. First of all, it's just you just want to do these things. You want to do your due diligence. You want to look and kind of rule everything out because it's the responsible thing to do. When you see signs of a possible infection, you want to just cover your bases and get those things checked. When we're talking about infections, like vaginal infections, things like that, it's not always an STI. So that's one thing to make quite clear. It doesn't necessarily, it could be, it certainly could be an STI because obviously STIs can change your vaginal discharge. Love that word, but it can. And so, we're not even talking about the overt, just like if you see green just discharge coming out of your vagina, like that's an overt sign of a possible STI. So we're not even talking about like the super obvious, or if you have like a foul smell or some of those more obvious symptoms. So what I'm talking about with the charting is actually ways to pick up the more subtle signs. And so just to kind of expand the view of what it could mean by infection or overgrowth. So think about my cold or flu example. And so infections and bacterial overgrowths are super, super common. Women, yeast infections are really, really common, bacterial vaginosis. And so, yeast is fungus and bacterial infections are bacterial. So it is possible that if you have a bit of a fungal infection or overgrowth or a bit of a bacterial infection, that it can make an impact and actually change the color and the quality of your mucus, meaning that when you do see mucus observations that are outside of what we would consider to be normal and healthy, going and getting a screen is a really important step just to make sure that we are covering all our bases, to make sure that you don't actually have any infections that are going untreated. So to recap, there's 3 factors that I wanted to point out today that can contribute to abnormal cervical mucus, cervical observations, and those are hormonal contraceptive use, especially long-term use, nutritional deficiencies, kind of dietary stuff that's going on, and also bacterial overgrowth / infections. So this brings us to, what to do. Because ultimately that's what we need to know. Like we need to know, what do we do about this? If I suspect that there might be something wrong, what can I actually do to support my body and to really fix this? So, one of the first things that you can do is to actually chart your cycles and start to pay really close attention to what's happening and be just as diligent charting your cycle, at the beginning and the end as you do during your fertile window. So one of the questions I often get from my clients who are actively trying for pregnancy, for example, actively trying to get pregnant, is because there's a really obvious tendency then if you're trying to conceive, like you're going to be super diligent about the charting before ovulation, but then as soon as you ovulate, like you're kind of done, like peace out, I'm not going to check my cervix anymore, I'm not going to check my mucus, and maybe I'll check my temperature. And so that's pretty common. But one of the things that I always do is when I'm working with someone, I encourage them to continue to be just as diligent checking and charting all throughout their cycle, because I am not only paying attention to their cycle for the purpose of conceiving or avoiding. I want to know if your cervix is healthy. And one of the best ways for me to know that is by watching your cervical mucus patterns throughout your whole cycle. And so that's something that I teach my clients how to do, because then when they're done working with me, they still have the ability to do that. So throughout their whole lives now, they have the ability to continue to check for mucus, throughout their whole cycle and pay really close attention to what's happening with their cervical health. And if anything is ever off, they'll immediately know by their observations. So as we spoke about, another important aspect of this is to ensure that you're getting sufficient nutrition. So to really look at your nutritional intakes, your diet, make sure that you're getting enough B vitamins, folate, ensure you're getting enough retinol, ensure you're supporting your immune system, not eating too much sugar, making sure that you have a balance of really healthy, real unprocessed foods. There's a big focus on nutrition beyond the scope of what I'm going to talk about today. But suffice it to say that, when you're seeing issues with your cervix, you really want to pay close attention to your nutritional intakes. Now, a third aspect of this is gut health, because your gut health is intimately connected to your vaginal flora. So for instance, if you find that you have a bacterial infection, an overgrowth, fungal overgrowth, or some sort of issue, if you're able to identify that by charting your cycles and looking at your mucus patterns, then one of the things that you're going to want to do, in addition to any medical treatment that you require to get rid of the infection, one of the things that you're going to want to do is ensure that you're supporting your vaginal health by supporting your vaginal flora. And so one of the ways to do that is just by incorporating fermented foods, making sure that you're, taking some sort of probiotic but in general, doing something to ensure that you are enhancing your gut flora. And so you do that by consuming foods that are abundant in microbes. So fermented foods, if you have the ability to ferment foods yourself, if you're really keen and you like to do that, and you like to make sauerkraut, and you like to make kombucha, or you like to make kefir or something like that, then utilize that, and certainly, dive in and make yourself some fermented foods and consume them. Because when you do have the ability to make fermented foods from scratch, they typically have quite a high bacterial count, meaning that they're quite potent and strong. And so that's good because it's getting you a lot of the good microbes. The other thing is that you want a diversity of microbes. So if you're working with a functional practitioner, there's a lot of specific strains of bacteria that have been studied. And so if you're working with a functional practitioner, they may actually be able to prescribe specific strains to do specific things. But, you don't necessarily have to take it that far. You can just look for your garden variety probiotic that contains several strains. The caveat is that you do want to consult with your practitioner. You do want to be cautious. Depending on where you are at currently in terms of your gut health, adding in probiotics or even probiotic foods can actually make you uncomfortable. So I've had a number of clients who maybe they get really excited. And so they go and drink half a liter of kefir or something and then end up with a really bad tummy ache. So like anything else, if you're incorporating new foods, you may want to consult with a practitioner, or you just want to go easy. Don't drink the whole liter of kefir the first time. Don't eat 2 bowls of sauerkraut. If you've never had sauerkraut before, maybe start with 1 bite and see how it goes and gradually increase. Because when you do consume probiotics, if you think about what you're doing, what you're trying to do is you're trying to change your gut flora. For instance, if you get chronic yeast infections, that is a pretty strong indicator that your gut flora could be off, because there's an intimate connection between your vaginal and your gut flora. And so if you think about all of a sudden now you're going to consume these different foods, you're trying to populate your gut with different bacteria. You're trying to change if you think about your gut, it's like there's a convention going on in there. It already has residents. And so they've taken up shop. They're quite comfortable. So when you introduce new and different bacteria into that, it can really disrupt the established community that is in there. And so that's why you just want to be really aware, and you want to be very intentional if you do make any changes in that way, knowing that it may not affect you at all, or it could affect you. So you want to take it easy. To summarize, to kind of go back and just summarize everything we talked about today. This episode I really was excited to share with you because it's something that I've seen very, very consistently. Cervical health is extremely important. And it's one of those areas where I often find myself saying, if I wasn't doing this work, if I wasn't teaching women to chart their cycles and then meeting with them and paying close attention to their cervical mucus patterns, I often wonder how many of these types of issues would go unaddressed. And the answer, I don't know the answer, but I can tell you that it's a very common thing in my practice for me to support women to identify different issues with cervical health, where if they weren't charting, they wouldn't actually be aware of it. You literally wouldn't see it. And then I feel like I'm the cervix champion because I'm always so focused on the cervix. I want to know how your cervix is doing. I want to know how it's doing this cycle. I want to know if it's doing better, the same, or worse than it was last cycle. And if we do identify anything and implement any changes, I want to see how it's going to do next cycle so that we can have that measure of how we're doing. And so, we talked about what normal cervical mucus looks like. We talked about the difference between peak and non-peak. We talked about some of the signs that there might be something going on with your cervix, and that is through the observations of your cervical mucus. So we talked about mucus that is yellow, gummy, or observations that are wet outside of your fertile window. We talked about some of the reasons that could contribute to it. So hormonal contraceptive use, especially long-term use, nutrient deficiencies, and infections, bacterial overgrowth, those types of things. And then we talked about ways to support, which is through, making sure that you're charting so you're paying close attention to it, supporting your cervix with nutrients, making sure you're getting enough nutrition, and also supporting your gut and vaginal flora with fermented foods. Now, one of the important things to do that I didn't say, so I'm glad that I did this wrap up, is actually going to the doctor and getting yourself checked out. And so I just want to take a minute to talk about that, because a lot of women assume that if you go to the doctor and ask them to do a pap smear, where they actually will scrape your cervix and test the cells to make sure they're normal, a lot of women assume that when you're getting a pap, the doctor is automatically going to test for STIs and infections. No, let's be clear. I want this to be crystal clear. So that is not something, that is a separate test. It's a separate vial. It's a separate swab. And so if you want to make sure that you're getting a thorough test, if you are going to the doctor because you saw something and you're concerned about it, then you want to specifically ask. You say, I want a pap and I want to get an STI screen. I want you to screen me for any types of infections. And if you're concerned about, is my doctor going to do it or not, you just use that magical word discharge. You just say, I saw some discharge. It's off color and I'm a little bit concerned about it. And so I just wanted to make sure that you're going to test for STIs as well as any type of infections. Like, I don't know if it could be yeast or if it could be bacterial or fungal or something. So could you just check? So that's like a pro tip, because you can totally get a pap and not get a screen for STIs. It is a real thing, because those are two separate tests. And just because a doctor does a pap doesn't mean that they're going to do an STI screen or an infection, like a screen for infections like a culture or anything like that. So that brings us to the end of today's episode. And so now I want to hear what you think about it. So if you're not yet part of my Fertility Friday Facebook community, I want to invite you to jump in there so you can get your invitation to join the group by heading over to fertilityfriday.com/community. And in that group, on the day this episode airs, I'm going to put a thread in there, because I really wanted to get a sense from you. Have you ever had issues with cervical health? Have you ever had an abnormal pap before? Have you ever noticed anything strange on your chart and you weren't sure what it meant and all that type of thing? So I want to kind of get a sense of it. I know it's really common, and I think that's one of the important messages to take away from this episode is that if you do see something on your chart that's a little bit abnormal, know that it is common, but it's important to know the difference between what's considered normal and not. Like, what's the difference between optimal and not optimal, healthy and unhealthy? Because one of the things that I've seen a lot as a fertility awareness educator, I don't spend a lot of time in the forums, because I've got, I'm in my own Facebook group, and other than that, you don't really see me on Facebook a whole lot. But one of the things that I have seen in forums is women, it's really common when they'll post pictures of their cervical mucus and they'll share and they'll talk about it. And often I see mucus that looks actually quite unhealthy or like problematic, maybe off color, maybe a bit on the gummy side or something like that, because, forums, maybe the members don't necessarily know what to look for in terms of what's normal, what's abnormal. It just kind of, all the pictures just go up and no one's really looking at the cervical, the cervix, because who in your life has ever taught you how to monitor your cervix based on your cervical mucus, right? Like, no one. So that's one of the reasons I wanted to share this, because I feel like this is basic information that every woman should know. Like, we all should know that there is such a thing as normal mucus and abnormal, and it doesn't have to be green and smell like fish in order for you to have an infection. It can actually be a lot more subtle than that. And so we need to learn and be taught how to pay attention to those subtleties. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, you'll find the show notes page at fertilityfriday.com/191. That's fertilityfriday.com/191. So if you've been thinking about jumping into my 10-week Fertility Awareness Mastery Group program, but you haven't yet signed up, make sure to head over to fertilityfriday.com/group program to secure your spot today. We will be closing registration within about 2 weeks from the release of this episode. So there's only a short period of time before we're actually going to get started, jump in there and really start getting into the material. Now, if you're not listening to this episode in real time, I do offer these groups throughout the year. So you can always head over to the same site, fertilityfriday.com/group program, and you'll see when, the next opportunity is to join the program. So I just want to thank you so much for hanging out with me today, for taking the time to listen to this episode. I always say that I podcast for you. When I first started podcasting, it was just me in my basement by myself, and I didn't know if anyone was going to be on the other end. And over the past 3 years, I've created this amazing community, and I always say, like, I attract the nicest, sweetest women to me. And so it's been just a great journey, and I've been really enjoying it. And it's because of you that this podcast has continued to thrive and continue to grow. So I really appreciate all of you for sharing this show with your friends and for sharing episodes. I hear all the time, like, oh, my friend taught me, she shared this episode with me, and my nurse told me about the podcast, or, my practitioner told me I should listen to this podcast. So I really appreciate all of you for sharing the show and spreading the word, because ultimately I believe that every woman has the right to know exactly how her body and her fertility works. And so my mission is to do this one woman at a time. We all have the right to know, regardless of whether you ever intend to use the fertility awareness method for anything, whether you intend to ever try to use it as a birth control method, or you ever try to, use it to optimize sex for pregnancy. We still have a right to know how our bodies work. And that's the fundamental piece of this that I want to bring to every woman. So thank you so much for being a part of that. And as always, until next time, be well and happy charting.